Marcus Thompson had lived on his 15-acre ranch for nearly 20 years when the developers arrived. The rolling hills of Cedar Valley had been his sanctuary, where he raised cattle and horses in peaceful solitude. His property sat at the end of a winding dirt road that connected to the main highway through what had always been open rangeland. For 2 decades, he had enjoyed the freedom of wide-open spaces and the simple life of a rancher. The trouble began when Willow Creek Estates broke ground on the adjacent property. What had once been endless pasture was transformed into a sprawling subdivision of cookie-cutter homes, complete with manicured lawns and sidewalks. Marcus watched with growing unease as construction crews carved up the landscape he had known and loved. The developers promised that the new community would blend seamlessly with the existing rural character of the area, but Marcus knew better than to trust such assurances. Within 6 months of the first families moving into Willow Creek Estates, the Homeowners Association made its presence known. The HOA board consisted of recent transplants from the city, who had moved to the country seeking a quieter lifestyle but seemed determined to recreate the suburban experience they had left behind. They implemented strict rules about lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, and acceptable landscaping. What concerned Marcus most was their growing fixation on his ranch, which they viewed as an eyesore that threatened their property values. The first confrontation came on a Tuesday morning when Marcus found 3 well-dressed individuals standing at his front gate. The woman leading the group introduced herself as Patricia Williams, the HOA president. She was accompanied by 2 board members, Robert Chen and Linda Foster. Patricia explained that they were conducting a community assessment and wanted to discuss some concerns about his property. Marcus listened politely as Patricia outlined their grievances. His cattle created unpleasant odors that drifted into the subdivision. His horses made too much noise in the early morning hours. The dirt road leading to his ranch generated dust that settled on their clean cars and pristine homes. Most troubling of all, his property lacked the aesthetic appeal that residents expected when they purchased homes in what was marketed as an upscale rural community. The rancher remained calm as he explained that he had been there long before any of them had arrived. His cattle and horses were part of legitimate agricultural operations that predated their subdivision by decades. The dirt road was a private easement that he maintained at his own expense. He had no intention of changing his lifestyle to accommodate newcomers who had chosen to move next to a working ranch. Patricia smiled tightly and suggested that perhaps they could find some middle ground. The HOA was prepared to offer financial assistance for property improvements that would benefit everyone. They could help him pave the road, install better fencing, and even provide landscaping services to create attractive buffers between his ranch and their community. All they asked in return was his cooperation in addressing their concerns about noise, odors, and visual impact. Marcus declined their offers politely but firmly. He explained that his ranch was his livelihood and his home. He had worked hard to build something meaningful on this land, and he would not compromise his way of life for the sake of property values in a subdivision that had no right to dictate terms to established landowners. The meeting ended cordially enough, but Marcus sensed that this would not be the last he heard from the Willow Creek Estates HOA. Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified. Marcus received certified letters from the HOA attorney demanding that he address various alleged violations of county codes and zoning regulations. He discovered that someone had filed complaints with multiple government agencies claiming that his ranch operations were creating environmental hazards and disturbing the peace. Each complaint required time and money to address, even though investigations consistently found no violations. The harassment campaign reached a new level when Marcus noticed surveyors working along his property line. When he approached them, they produced official-looking documents claiming they were conducting a boundary survey at the request of the HOA. Marcus immediately contacted his own surveyor, discovered that the HOA was attempting to challenge the historical boundaries of his ranch. They claimed that portions of his property, including part of the access road, actually belonged to the subdivision. The legal battle that followed consumed months, thousands of dollars in attorney fees. Marcus was forced to produce decades-old deeds, survey records, and historical documents to prove ownership of land his family had worked for generations The HOA lawyers were relentless in their efforts to find any technicality that might give them leverage over his property. They questioned every fence line, every easement, and every structure on his ranch. During this period, Marcus began to notice strange activities around his property. His gates were found open in the morning, allowing his cattle to wander onto county roads. Feed troughs were contaminated with foreign substances that made his animals sick. Fence posts were damaged in ways that suggested deliberate sabotage rather than normal wear and tear. When he reported these incidents to local law enforcement, they promised to investigate, but no arrests were ever made. The situation escalated dramatically when Marcus returned from a weekend trip to find that the HOA had installed a fence completely blocking his access road. A solid 8-foot barrier now stood where the road had connected his property to the county highway. A locked gate prevented any vehicle from passing through, and posted signs declared the area private property of Willow Creek Estates. Marcus was effectively trapped on his own land with no legal way to reach the outside world. He immediately called the sheriff department, but the responding deputy seemed reluctant to take action. The fence was technically on property that the HOA claimed to own based on their disputed survey. Until the boundary issue was resolved in court, the deputy suggested that Marcus work with the HOA to arrange temporary access. This advice infuriated the rancher, who knew that giving the HOA any legitimacy in controlling his access would strengthen their legal position. Marcus contacted his attorney, who filed emergency motions seeking immediate removal of the fence. HOA responded with their own legal filings claiming that Marcus was trespassing on subdivision property and using their road without permission. They offered to grant him access in exchange for signing an agreement that would give them permanent easement rights and allow them to regulate his ranch operations. The legal wrangling could take months while Marcus remained effectively imprisoned on his own property. The first phone call came at 6 in the morning, 3 days later. Marcus was jolted awake by the ringing of his landline and stumbled to answer. Patricia Williams's voice was saccharine, sweet as she inquired whether he was ready to discuss reasonable accommodation for his access needs. She explained that the HOA board met every Tuesday evening and would be happy to consider his request for gate access if he submitted the proper application along with a modest processing fee. Marcus hung up without responding, but the calls continued. Every morning, at exactly 6 o'clock, his phone would ring with another offer to help him resolve his access problems. Different board members took turns making the calls, each one maintaining the pretense that they were simply trying to be helpful neighbors. They suggested various compromise solutions that would require Marcus to submit to HOA oversight of his ranch operations in exchange for permission to use what had always been his own road. The isolation began to take its toll on Marcus, both practically and emotionally. He had enough supplies to last several weeks, but his cattle needed veterinary care, and his horses required regular exercise beyond what his pastures could provide. More importantly, he had scheduled sales of livestock that would provide crucial income for his ranch operations. The HOA had effectively cut off his ability to conduct business while maintaining the facade that they were willing to negotiate reasonable terms. Marcus spent his days exploring every possible alternative route off his property. He walked his fence lines looking for forgotten easements or boundary disputes that might provide legal access to neighboring properties. He studied aerial photographs and historical surveys, hoping to find evidence of roads or paths that predated the subdivision. Every avenue seemed to lead to dead ends or require crossing property owned by people who were either sympathetic to the HOA or too intimidated to get involved in the dispute. The morning calls became a ritual of psychological warfare. Patricia would call to remind him that his cattle were probably getting lonely without access to different pastures. Robert would suggest that his horses needed socialization with other animals that could only happen if he was able to transport them off the property. Linda would express concern about his access to medical care in case of emergency and offer to arrange for ambulance service. If he would just sign their access agreement, each conversation followed the same pattern. The caller would begin with false sympathy for his situation, then transition to helpful suggestions for resolving the problem. The solution always involved Marcus accepting some form of HOA control over his property in exchange for access rights. When he refused, They would remind him that they were being generous in even offering to negotiate. Marcus began to understand that this was exactly what the HOA had planned from the beginning. They never intended to coexist peacefully with his ranch operations. Their goal had always been to force him out or bring him under their control. Fence was not a response to legal disputes about property boundaries. It was a calculated move to create leverage that would force him to capitulate to their demands. The rancher decided that two could play the game of strategic patience. If the HOA wanted to make his life difficult, he would find ways to return the favor within the bounds of the law. He began documenting every phone call, every conversation, and every interaction with HOA representatives. He researched their legal vulnerabilities and started filing his own complaints with regulatory agencies about the subdivision practices that might violate county codes. Marcus discovered that the HOA had made several modifications to their community. Without proper permits, it altered drainage patterns that affected his property, installed lighting that exceeded county guidelines for rural areas, and created parking restrictions on what were technically public roads. He began filing formal complaints that would require the same kind of time-consuming responses that they had demanded from him. The morning calls continued, but Marcus noticed a subtle change in tone. The HOA representatives were still maintaining their helpful facade, but there was an undercurrent of frustration creeping into their voices. Patricia began making veiled references to the cost of maintaining the fence and gate system. Robert mentioned that some residents were questioning whether the board was handling the situation appropriately. Linda suggested that perhaps they could find a solution that would benefit everyone if Marcus would just be more reasonable. Winter was approaching, and Marcus knew that his isolation would become more challenging when snow made his property even more difficult to access by alternative means. He had stockpiled supplies and made arrangements for emergency services, but the psychological pressure of being cut off from the world was wearing on him. The HOA was counting on this pressure to force his surrender, but Marcus was determined to prove that a working rancher had more patience and resilience than suburban board members. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus received a visit from Tom Bradley, a local attorney who specialized in property rights and rural land use issues. Tom had heard about the situation through mutual friends and was intrigued by the legal implications of an HOA blocking access to a pre-existing ranch. He offered to represent Marcus on a contingency basis because he believed the case could set important precedents for property rights throughout the region. Tom Bradley's review of the situation revealed several serious legal problems with the HOA actions. The fence blocking Marcus' access violated state laws regarding landlocked properties. The HOA claims to road ownership were based on faulty surveys that ignored historical easements and usage patterns. Most importantly, their pattern of harassment and attempts to force Marcus into compliance could constitute actionable interference with his business operations. The attorney filed a comprehensive lawsuit seeking not only removal of the fence, but also monetary damages for the harm caused to Marcus's ranch operations. The suit alleged that the HOA had engaged in a systematic campaign to drive him out of business through illegal interference with his property rights. Tom demanded immediate injunctive relief to restore access, while the broader legal issues were resolved through the court system. The HOA initially responded with their usual tactics of delay and obfuscation, but Tom Bradley was not easily intimidated. He filed motions for expedited hearings and demanded discovery of all HOA communications regarding Marcus's property. When the HOA tried to claim that their actions were protected by their legitimate authority to regulate community standards, Tom produced evidence showing that Marcus Ranch predated their subdivision and was never subject to their oversight. The tide began to turn when the county engineering department completed their own survey of the disputed road. Their findings confirmed that the access route had been established decades before the subdivision was built, and that Marcus held legitimate easement rights that could not be extinguished by subsequent development. The county issued a formal order requiring the HOA to remove any barriers that interfered with legitimate property access. Patricia Williams called Marcus the morning after the county order was issued, but her tone had changed dramatically. Gone was the condescending helpfulness that had characterized their previous conversations. Instead, she spoke in clipped professional terms. about the HOA desire to resolve their differences through negotiation rather than continued litigation. She suggested that perhaps they had been hasty in their actions, and that accommodation could be found that would satisfy everyone involved. Marcus listened to her proposal with grim satisfaction. The HOA was now offering to remove the fence immediately in exchange for his agreement not to pursue monetary damages for the harm they had caused. They wanted him to sign a release acknowledging that their dispute had been based on legitimate disagreements about property rights rather than deliberate harassment. In essence, they wanted to escape liability for their actions, while maintaining that they had acted in good faith throughout the conflict. The rancher declined their settlement offer and instructed them to deal with his attorney. Tom Bradley had made it clear that they would not be satisfied with simply removing the fence. The HOA would be held accountable for the full extent of their interference with Marcus's business operations and their systematic campaign to force him off his property. The lawsuit would proceed unless they were prepared to pay substantial damages and acknowledge their wrongdoing. Over the following weeks, the fence remained in place, but the morning phone calls took on an increasingly desperate tone. Different board members called to plead their case and explained that they had only been trying to protect their community property values. They insisted that they bore no personal animosity toward Marcus and had simply been trying to find solutions that would work for everyone. Some callers even suggested that certain board members had acted without proper authorization from the full HOA. Membership Marcus began to enjoy these conversations in a way that surprised him. After months of being powerless to respond to their harassment, he finally had leverage of his own. Each morning when the phone rang, he would listen patiently to their increasingly frantic offers, and then politely refer them to his attorney. He made it clear that he was no longer interested in negotiating directly with people who had proven themselves to be untrustworthy. The legal discovery process revealed the extent of the HOA campaign against Marcus Ranch. Internal emails showed that board members had coordinated their harassment efforts and had specifically discussed strategies for making his life difficult enough to force him to sell his property or submit to their control. They had researched his financial situation and had timed their legal challenges to coincide with periods when they knew he would be most vulnerable to economic pressure. Most damaging of all, the discovery revealed that the HOA had been in contact with developers who were interested in purchasing Marcus's property for additional subdivision development. The board had apparently believed that if they could force him out, his ranch would be available for acquisition at below-market prices. Their actions were not motivated by legitimate community concerns, but by the potential for profit from future development of his land. Tom Bradley used this evidence to expand the lawsuit to include claims for conspiracy and intentional interference with prospective business relationships. The case was no longer simply about removing a fence, but about holding the HOA accountable for a calculated scheme to deprive Marcus of his property rights. The potential damages now included not only his direct losses, but also punitive damages, designed to deter similar conduct by other HOAs. The morning phone calls became increasingly surreal as the legal pressure mounted. Board members who had once spoken with authority and confidence now sounded defeated and desperate. They began making personal appeals to Marcus's sense of neighborliness and community spirit. Patricia Williams actually cried during one call as she explained that the legal fees were bankrupting the HOA and that innocent homeowners were being forced to pay special assessments to fund their defense. Marcus felt no sympathy for their plight. These were the same people who had shown no concern for the financial hardship they were causing him. When they blocked his access and interfered with his business operations, they had been perfectly willing to destroy his livelihood in pursuit of their goals, but now expected mercy when they faced consequences for their actions. The rancher made it clear that they had created this situation through their own choices and would have to live with the results. The breakthrough in the case came when one of the HOA board members broke ranks and agreed to cooperate with Marcus's legal team. Linda Foster had apparently grown uncomfortable with the direction of the campaign against the ranch and was willing to testify about internal board discussions and decision-making processes. Her testimony would provide crucial evidence about the premeditated nature of the HOA actions and their true motivations. Faced with the prospect of a former board member testifying against them, the remaining HOA leadership substantial monetary damages to Marcus for his losses, and acknowledge in writing that their actions had been improper and illegal. The settlement also included provisions requiring the HOA to refrain from any future interference with his ranch operations and to respect his property rights. The fence came down on a Thursday morning, exactly 8 months after it had been erected. Marcus stood watching as the contractors hired by the HOA dismantled the barrier that had imprisoned him on his own property for so long. The locked gate that had symbolized their power over his life was loaded onto a truck and hauled away. The access road that had served his ranch for decades was once again open and unobstructed. The morning phone call stopped immediately after the fence was removed. Patricia Williams, Robert Chen, and the other board members apparently had nothing more to say to the rancher they had spent months harassing. The silence was more satisfying to Marcus than any apology could have been. He had proven that determined resistance could overcome even the most coordinated campaign of harassment and intimidation. Marcus used the settlement money to make improvements to his ranch that had been delayed by the legal battle. He upgraded his cattle facilities, installed better fencing around his pastures, and purchased new equipment that would make his operations more efficient. The financial compensation could not restore the months of stress and isolation he had endured, but it enabled him to strengthen his ranch against any future challenges. The legal victory had implications beyond Marcus's individual situation. Bradley used the case as precedent in other disputes involving HOA overreach and property rights. The decision established clear boundaries for HOA authority and provided legal remedies for property owners who faced similar harassment. Rural landowners throughout the region now had legal protection against attempts by suburban developments to impose their standards on pre-existing agricultural operations. The Willow Creek Estates HOA underwent significant changes in leadership and policies following their defeat in court. Several board members resigned in disgrace, and new leadership implemented policies designed to prevent future conflicts with neighboring properties. The community was forced to pay substantial special assessments to cover the legal costs and damages from their failed campaign against Marcus Ranch. Some residents of the subdivision approached Marcus to apologize for their HOA actions and to express their respect for his determination to defend his property rights. They explained that they had not been aware of the full extent of the board harassment campaign and had been told that the dispute was simply about legitimate boundary issues. These conversations helped Marcus understand that not all of his neighbors had supported the campaign against him. Marcus began to receive invitations to speak at property rights organizations and rural landowner associations about his experience fighting HOA overreach. He discovered that his situation was not unique, and that many rural property owners faced similar pressures from encroaching suburban development. His victory provided both inspiration and practical legal strategies for others. Facing comparable challenges, the rancher also became more involved in local politics and land use planning to ensure that future development would be required to respect existing agricultural operations. He worked with county officials to strengthen protections for rural properties and to establish clearer guidelines for HOA authority over neighboring lands. His experience had taught him that defending property rights required vigilance and engagement. With the political process, years later, Marcus would still occasionally encounter former HOA board members in town or at community events. These meetings were invariably awkward affairs, with the former antagonists maintaining polite distance while avoiding any reference to their previous conflict. Patricia Williams had moved away from the area within a year of the settlement, apparently. Unable to face the community she had led into such an expensive and embarrassing defeat, the ranch prospered in the years following the legal victory. Marcus expanded his cattle operation and began offering horse boarding services to residents of the area who appreciated his expertise and facilities. Some of his customers were actually residents of Willow Creek Estates, who would come to respect his knowledge and dedication to animal husbandry. The ranch that the HOA had viewed as an eyesore became a valued part of the community. Marcus never forgot the lessons learned during his months of isolation and harassment. He maintained detailed records of all his activities and interactions, in case anyone ever again attempted to challenge his property rights. He also developed relationships with other rural landowners in the area. to create a network of mutual support against future threats from development pressure. The morning silence that replaced the harassing phone calls became one of Marcus's most treasured aspects of his daily routine. He would wake each day to the natural sounds of his ranch, the lowing of cattle, the neighing of horses, and the songs of birds.
Rather
than the artificial intrusion of hostile voices on his telephone, the peace he had fought so hard to preserve was sweeter for having been temporarily lost and then reclaimed. The legal precedent established by Marcus, Victory continued to provide protection for other rural property owners facing similar challenges. Courts throughout the region cited his case when ruling on disputes between agricultural operations and encroaching suburban development. The decision helped establish the principle that property rights predating subdivision development could not be extinguished by subsequent HOA formation or community standards. Marcus sometimes reflected on how different his life might have been if he had simply capitulated to the HOA demands when they first approached him with their concerns about his ranch operations. He might have avoided months of stress and legal battles by agreeing to modify his activities to accommodate their preferences. But he knew that such compromise would have been the beginning of the end for his way of life. The rancher understood that the HOA campaign had never really been about noise or odors or visual aesthetics. It had been about power and control, and the belief that newer residents had the right to reshape their environment according to their preferences regardless of the impact on established landowners. By fighting back, he had not only preserved his own property rights, but had helped establish legal protections for others facing similar challenges. The experience had also taught Marcus valuable lessons about the importance of community relationships and political engagement. He realized that rural landowners could not simply retreat to their properties and ignore the political and legal forces that shaped land use policy. Defending agricultural way of life required active participation in the processes that determined how communities developed and evolved. Marcus continued to live on his ranch and operate his cattle and horse business with the knowledge that his property rights were secure and legally protected. The fence that had once blocked his access was gone but not forgotten. It served as a reminder of what could be lost when property owners failed to defend their rights, and what could be achieved when they fought back with determination and proper legal support. The HOA, that had once seemed so powerful and threatening, had been revealed as a paper tiger when confronted with someone willing to stand up to their intimidation tactics. Their morning phone calls that had once been a source of stress and anger had become a symbol of their desperation and ultimate defeat. The silence that replaced those calls was the sound of victory and the restoration of peace to a place that had been Marcus' home for over 20 years. In the end, the story of the fence and the phone calls became a cautionary tale about the dangers of HOA overreach and the HOA overreach and the HOA overreach and the HOAs against organized harassment campaigns. It demonstrated that even the most determined and well-funded opponents could be defeated when property owners were willing to fight back with proper legal representation and unwavering commitment to their rights. Marcus Ranch remained a working agricultural operation surrounded by suburban development, but no longer threatened by the unreasonable demands of hostile neighbors. The land that had been his sanctuary for 2 decades continued to provide him with both livelihood and peace of mind. The morning calls that had once disturbed his sleep were replaced by the natural sounds of a ranch awakening to another day of honest work and simple pleasures. The rancher had learned that sometimes the price of peace was the willingness to fight for it, and that property rights meant nothing without the courage to defend them against those who would take them away. His victory had preserved not only his own way of life, but had helped protect the rights of rural landowners throughout the region who faced similar pressures from encroaching development and overreaching homeowners associations. Years passed, and the memory of the fence and the phone calls faded into local legend, but the legal precedent and the lessons learned remained as important as ever. Marcus Ranch stood as a testament to the principle that property rights belong to those willing to defend them, and that no amount of organized harassment could defeat someone who refused to surrender what was rightfully theirs. The morning silence continued to be golden and the gates remained open to those who approached with respect rather than demands.